Zoom presentations. They always seem a little technologically daunting to me, so I would just ask for you to be a little bit, have a little bit of patience with me as I try to navigate the PowerPoint and whatnot. Before we get to the ghost stories of Sullivan County, I just want to take a moment for a little self-promotion. Some of you may know I have a new book out, came out in February of this year, called In Further Retrospect. It's the third time we've collected my favorite retrospect columns that have run weekly since 1987. There are about 70 columns, I guess, in the book. And for those of you who are looking for ways of ordering the book, obviously, because of the COVID restrictions, we had to cancel our book signings and whatnot. So there are two ways to order the book. If you would like, you can go to Amazon.com. The book is available there. You can order through Amazon with your credit card. And it ends up, I think, if you live in New York, at least, it ends up costing you a little over $30 with the tax and the shipping for the book. You can also order the book directly from the Delaware Company, and the Delaware Company is the nonprofit history education group that I helped found in 2012 that actually published the book. And you can get the book by making a donation of $30 or more. We hope you'll focus on the or more part. $30 or more to the Delaware Company, and you can mail that directly to us at P.O. Box 88 in Barryville, New York, 12719, and just make sure you get your name and address in there so that we know where to send the book. We'll get it right out, and you'll get a signed and or inscribed copy of the book if you'd like. Just tell us who to inscribe it to, and that's so $30 or more to the Delaware Company. Again, it's Post Office Box 88, Barryville, New York, 12719. So again, in further retrospect, I appreciate the support. Ghost Stories of Sullivan County. This is actually Ghost Stories of Sullivan County Part 2. So let me see if I can call up the PowerPoint here. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, is everyone seeing that? Sullivan County Ghost Stories Part 2. Let me start by saying that what I discussed tonight are ghost stories, but I want to make it clear that as an historian, what I'm really talking about are the historical events that lead up to the reports that these ghosts have appeared, or that this paranormal activity takes place. So in doing my presentation, I'm going to talk about the ghosts as if they exist, but I don't want it to seem as if I'm vouching for the existence of these ghosts. And I know many of you probably don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not so sure that I do or I don't. But my focus is on the historical events that led up to these ghost stories. And I mention that for a reason. In part one, which I'm sure many of you have seen, I've done it a few times, we talked about a number of haunted places in the county. The famous haunted house in the Village of Liberty, which was perpetuated for eternity, really, by an Otto Hillig postcard of the burning of the haunted house burning, and the ghost actually escaping from the flames. It's a famous postcard that's out there, and in fact, it's the background that you'll notice perhaps on any of the slides that I'm doing tonight that have text to them. You'll notice the famous postcard. We also talked about the Peddler's Ghost, which was a house belonging to a man named Smith Rogers in between Kiamisha Lake and Thompsonville, which dates back to 1894. That house is also burned down, and probably in both of those cases, the houses were burned to try to exorcise the ghost. I think there was a conscious effort to rid the area of the ghost's presence. We talked about the Burnbrae Mansion in Glens Bay, which is one of the great ghost stories of Sullivan County history. And Burnbrae Mansion, which is one of the 8 Mackenzie mansions that were built as summer homes in Glens Bay in the early 20th century, is still there and has been restored about 35 years ago by Mike Frazee, the bicycling legend. And his family still runs it, and they do haunted houses there now. Probably right now they probably have haunted houses going on at the Burnbrae Mansion. And of course, what is probably the second most famous ghost story in Sullivan County history is the story of Laura Darling Call, who is said to haunt the Western Hotel that her parents owned in Callicoon. The Western Hotel, of course, is still standing in Callicoon, still in operation, and you can go online and find where people have visited looking for the ghost and whatnot, and they've filed some blogs online about that story. So those were some of the places that we talked about in part 1. I would mention that there are many other purportedly haunted places in Sullivan County, from the Monticello Hospital to the Loomis Sanatorium and many places in between, which I don't include in my presentations simply because, as I said, I'm talking about the historical events that have led up to the ghost sightings, and I don't have historical events that would support the notion of ghosts being in those places, although I'm not disputing it. And maybe it's, at some point I will have that information. So we're going to talk about 5 haunted places in Sullivan County in this presentation tonight. We're going to start number 5 with 10 Mile River. And the story of the hauntings at 10 Mile River date back to 1763. And this is one of our earliest ghost sightings, although, or the earliest events that have led up to the ghost sightings, although not the earliest. But the 10 Mile River story is a fascinating story. And again, this is the historical background. So some of you may be aware that the European settlement of the area that later became Sullivan County began in the mid 1750s, around 1755 or so. By 1757, there were 30 or so families living in the upper Delaware on both sides of the Delaware River. So part of what is today Sullivan County and part of what is today Wayne County in Pennsylvania. This map that I'm showing on the screen is a drawing that was done by one of my predecessors, James W. Burbank, who happened to be a professional artist. And I don't expect that you can read a lot of it, but the point I wanted to make is that the settlement of Cushitunk, which is what the Europeans from Connecticut called this place they settled along the upper Delaware, stretched from about present day Lackawaxen or Minisink Ford on the New York side, up to about Callicoon. So it was about 30 miles north and south, and on each side of the river, they owned about 8 or 10 miles of wide of land, and that was their settlement. So even though there were 30 or so families, it was fairly sparsely inhabited. The lowest part that was actually settled was at the confluence of 10 Mile River and the Delaware, which is approximately 8 miles below present-day Narrowsburg. So that's the area that we're talking about. And we know that the family of Isaac Tracy and a number of others had settled in that area, and they were farmers. So we fast forward to, again, these were all settlers who had come from Connecticut, where farmland was very difficult to obtain. They wanted to own their own land. They wanted to own their own farms. And so they went to the colonial governor of Connecticut, which, by the way, claimed that its charter gave them the right to this land. Connecticut believed that this was all part of their colony. And so the governor gave these folks permission to come, not just to the eastern side of the Delaware River, but also the western side. Two companies were formed in Connecticut, the Susquehanna Company, which was large, about 600 people, and they moved to the Susquehanna River and they set up a settlement there. There were some members of that company that were also part of a smaller company called the Delaware Company, and they purchased land from the Native Americans and settled along the Delaware River, called the place Cushytung. And their idea again was to farm. At that time, the Native Americans that had lived here had largely moved from the area. By 1730, we don't see much of a Native American presence here in terms of settlements. There were some stray families here. There were some individuals who continued to hunt and trap here. But for the most part, the Lenape, or the Delaware as they were known to the English, had moved to the Susquehanna River, to the Wyoming Valley, to the area that today we would consider Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And they were living there, several hundred of them, under the chief Tidiuscung. And Tidiuscung was a very well-respected and beloved chieftain of the Lenape people of the Delaware. But he was also a very controversial figure, and there was much tension in the area at the time because the Lenape, the Delawares, had been conquered, subjugated by the Seneca, which was an Iroquois tribe from the north. And so the Seneca believed that anything that the Delaware owned now belonged to them. And they felt that the Delaware's land sales to the Susquehanna Company and to the Delaware Company were unjust, and that created tension. Tidiuscung also was distrustful, although on the surface he got along well with the English residents of the Wyoming Valley. He was very distrustful of them. And in April of 1763, Tidiuscung dies. He dies in a fire. His home burns to the ground. Some people believe that he was murdered and the fire was set to cover up the murder. To this day, we do not know who killed Tidiuscung. It could have been the Seneca. It could have been an accident that he died. He was known to drink too much. He might have inadvertently set fire to his own home and died in the fire. It could have been the settlers in the Wyoming Valley from the Susquehanna Company. We don't know. But his son, who was known as Captain Bull, was quite sure that it was the European settlers who had killed his father. And so he begins to plot to avenge his father's death. And he raises a war party, and in October of 1763, he attacks the European settlers along the Susquehanna, and he kills a number of them, men, women, and children. And the war party sweeps along, following the path that these settlers had taken to the upper Delaware, because the Delaware Company and the Susquehanna Company were linked, and his idea was to avenge his father's death by killing as many of the European settlers as he could. So he comes along the Lackawaxen River to the Delaware, and he moves upriver. The first settlement he comes to is at 10 Mile River, and he massacres the families living there. There are about 22 men, women, and children living at the settlement, and it's a surprise attack. They wipe them out. They burn down all of their homes. They burn their fields. Nothing is left. And by the way, he continues northward along the Delaware, where he's eventually rebuffed by the settlers at the lower fort, which is the part of the settlement that Fort Delaware today replicates. But the lower fort was actually on the Pennsylvania side, just north of Narrowsburg. He tries to attack that, but he's turned away. he decides to retreat. But meanwhile, he's massacred these people at 10 Mile River. What did I do here? So here's what was recorded by one of the Delaware Indian historians. Westlager writes that back east on the Susquehanna, Captain Bull, one of T.D. Uskin's sons, organized a war party that swept through the Wyoming Valley in the fall of 1763. Many settlers, including women and children, were tortured and killed, and about 20 prisoners were taken. In what has been recorded as the first Wyoming massacre, the second on July 3rd, 1778, when 400 British and 700 Indians raided the valley, the Indians collecting more than 200 white scalps, which they sold to the British for $10 each. That is taken from Westlager's book, The Delaware Indians, A History, which was published back in 1762. The Delaware warriors descended the Lackawaxen Creek to the Delaware, intending to exterminate all of their foes in the Cushitunk settlement several miles up the Delaware above that point. They first attacked the settlement at the mouth of 10 Mile River and laid it to waste by fire and tomahawk. Not a single human, man, woman, or child escaped to tell what happened, and every vestige of civilization except the bare fields was destroyed. Very little has been written about the massacre of 1763. I've written some about it myself. I've only recently begun to research it. But reports of paranormal activity at the confluence of the 10 Mile River and the Delaware have been going on for a number of years. And quite by accident, I came upon a video on YouTube of a group called Catskill Paranormal. And a little bit later on in my presentation tonight, we'll talk about a second group called Sullivan Paranormal. They're not the same group. They're two separate groups. Catskill Paranormal actually went to investigate the reports of paranormal activity at the 10 Mile River settlement. And they posted the video on YouTube. I urge you to look at it to get a little bit more of the story, although they're not historically accurate in some of what they say. But the video itself is quite fascinating. And because they did it at night, it's very appropriate for a ghost story. But what they uncover will leave you a little unsettled, I think. So I invite you to, there's the address if you want to write it down. That will take you to YouTube and to the video of Catskill Paranormal at the 10 Mile River settlement. So that's the first of our ghost stories. Moving along both in time and in space, we come to ghost story number 4, which is at the Smith Hill Cut along the O&W railway track. And the historical events that lead up to the paranormal activity there occur in February of 1907. Some of you are probably familiar with Hurleyville. Hurleyville is obviously still in existence. It grew up around the O&W Railroad, although the name Hurleyville and the community in one sense dates back to about 1805, and the settlement there of a man named William Hurley, who envisioned it being a great village to rival Monticello and Liberty, because it was on the main road, the only road between those two large settlements. And Hurley imagined that it would grow to be of equal importance to them. However, he did little to advance that vision, and other communities where there were more enterprising settlers eclipsed it. And for many years, there was only one house in Hurleyville, and that was Hurley's house himself. But once the railroad arrived in the 1870s, Hurleyville began to grow. And you can see from this picture, and some of these buildings are still standing, but you can see down to the lower left of the photo, if you look carefully, is the railroad crossing. And today the rail trail is an important part of the revitalization of Hurleyville. By the way, the church you see in the foreground, was actually following a major fire in Hurleyville in 1911, the church was sold to the Jewish congregation in Hurleyville, and today the synagogue sits on that site, and I believe is built on the remains of the church. So Hurleyville owes its existence to the O&W Railroad. They put a station there, and in fact, it was a very popular station. As you can see from here, what you're looking at in this slide is actually the second station in Hurleyville. This station was built in 1912, opened in 1912, and this station is still there, minus the right-hand part of it. That was taken away, but the rest of the station is still there in Hurleyville to this day. But you can see how many folks got off. At one point in time, the Hurleyville train station serviced 40 hotels around Hurleyville, so it was quite a popular stop. Beginning in 1903, when the O&W opened its branch line to Kingston, after it acquired the Monticello and Port Jervis Railroad and it began to expand, its stops from that point forward included the community of Hurley in Ulster County. And so there was a lot of confusion that came up between Hurley and Hurleyville. And so the railroad asked the folks in Hurleyville if they would consider renaming the station. And one of the locals, prominent local residents, Dr. Decay, by the way, he was not only the medical doctor in town, William Decay, but he was also the local dentist. And I always thought that was really amazing to have the local dentist named Dr. Decay. At any rate, and I can't hear you if you're laughing, but I'm sure you all are laughing at this point. At any rate, Dr. Decay, who had a son serve in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, suggested that they rename it Luzon Station. And so for a number of years after 1903, the railroad station in Hurleyville was known as Luzon Station. Some old timers, including my grandfather, always referred to Hurleyville as Luzon. But the official name, the post office and whatnot, never changed. So I just wanted to clear that up. The name Luzon dates to 1903, not earlier than that. And the post office never changed. It was the railroad station. So if you bought a ticket in Weehawken to come to Hurleyville, your ticket would say, after 1903, your ticket would say Luzon or Luzon Station. That's where you would get off. So at any rate, the railroad was the critical part of the growth of the community. This is the original railroad station, and this is the station that would have been there in February of 1907 when this event that we're going to discuss now took place. It was a wooden station and considerably smaller than the station that is currently there, although it was on the same piece of land, same place. And you can see that the road that goes off to the right, which is the back of the station, that is called Railroad Avenue to this day. The railroad tracks are just to the left of that building, which is the front. And that's the rail trail today. We call it the Milk Train Trail, and it's a great place to hike. And then there's another road beyond that, which is Mongop Road today. But in February of 1907, here's another picture after the Hurleyville Creamery was built around the turn of the century. And that's the building, the white building that you see to the left of the train station. So in February of 1907, the Mountaineer, which was a regular train that brought passengers up into the mountains from New York, really from Weehawken, was on its way here from Middletown. It had left Middletown around noon, was due into Hurleyville at 3 o'clock, and it was running a little bit late. So on this frigid, cold day, it was pushing. It was really pushing speed-wise, and so the boiler was being overtaxed. And when the train exited the Smith Hill Cut, which was a rock cut on the rail line, the boiler exploded, and 3 crewmen were killed. They weren't just killed; Two of them were blown to bits, literally. One was decapitated. The third man was severely injured, and they found him in a field, and he died shortly thereafter. So according to contemporary newspaper accounts, the engine was drawing the number 3 train, one of the finest on the road, and was doing about 40 miles per hour when suddenly there was a terrible roar and the sound of ripping and tearing of iron. The train of cars rammed the wreck, so the boiler explodes, the engine and the coal car are destroyed, and all of the passenger cars and the other cars that follow are not damaged by the explosion, but they ram into the exploded vehicles. 4 of them are derailed, and when the steam cleared, there was nothing but scrap iron left of the locomotive, which is what tows the cars. Here's a picture of the wreck along, so the train tracks are out of the frame to the right. The rock cut would be just beyond this wreck. So the train would continue on for a number of cars here, 100 yards or so beyond this, and then the rock cut. So you can see the destroyed boiler there. The engine is totally destroyed, and some of the other cars have been damaged. 12 of the passengers were injured in the wreck. None of the passengers were killed, but 3 crewmen were killed. Now you see the arrow. I'm not sure if you can see the arrow about in the upper middle part of the picture. That's where one of the bodies was found of the crewmen. They were hundreds of feet from the wreck, and the head of one of the men was found elsewhere. Here's another picture on the other side of the tracks where you can see some of the passenger cars were derailed. Yet another photo. So it was a gruesome scene. The body of the train's engineer, a man named William Gadwood from Walton, New York, was discovered more than 100 feet from the wreck. He was alive but severely injured when found, his skull fractured in several places. He died shortly afterward. The mangled body of fireman Martin Mullen, who was believed to have been killed instantly in the explosion, was found 100 feet in the opposite direction. A third man, later identified as O&W employee J.D. Volquette, was also killed in the explosion. So this is the rock cut. This is the Smith Hill cut. And for those of you who don't know exactly what I mean by a rock cut, so think about trains running along the tracks. Trains do not go up and down hills very well. They can't accommodate more than about a 6% grade. So when the railroad was laying the track and they came to a hill, they had to cut through it because the train can't go up the hill. So they either had to go around it or cut through it. The O&W had an advantage because it wasn't built until around 1870. And by that time, dynamite had been invented. When the Erie Railroad was built, they didn't have dynamite. And so that really created a lot of problems for the Erie Railroad, which was built in the 1830s and early 40s, in terms of building tunnels or doing these rock cuts. But this rock cut, which is at Smith Hill, which is about between a quarter and a half mile from Main Street in Hurleyville, it was actually dug out originally by the Midland Railroad, which was the original railroad that built the tracks. And then when the O&W took over later, it was actually, the cut was increased to make it even more level. So this is what it looks like today. This is the rail trail that goes through. The rock cut has been commonly reported to be full of paranormal activity. Here's another view of it. And also it's very cold. And paranormal investigators tell me that in order for ghosts or spirits to manifest themselves physically, to be seen or heard, they have to draw energy from the surroundings in order to manifest. And so the temperature of the surrounding air drops precipitously. And that's why almost any ghost sighting almost always is accompanied by people reporting a severe drop in temperature. Oftentimes you go to the rock cut and it's considerably colder than any of the air around it. So the paranormal activity, and some investigators have gone and verified the activity, is believed to possibly be the result of that train wreck and those 3 crewmen. Again, paranormal investigators explained to me that when there's a violent death, and particularly if a body is in some way mutilated, especially decapitation, it's much more likely that the spirit is trapped in this realm and it can't cross over because it's not intact, the body's not intact. And so they're more likely to be paranormal sightings around areas associated with violent deaths. And certainly this would qualify. Now, there are others who claim that the paranormal activity on the rock cut is the result of other things. This is a recent photo that was taken by a frequenter of the rail trail. This is part of the rock cut. And you can see it's kind of a human face, sort of a human face there. I'm being a little bit facetious, but some people say that there are all these presences. There are people watching in the rock cut, and these are their manifestations. But at any rate, the Smith Hill cut is our 4th story. And the historical background is the wreck of February 13th, 1907. Moving forward, we go to Corwin Farm, which dates to 1784. And Corwin Farm is actually owned by the National Park Service, sometimes also known as Cowan Farm, and that might actually be its correct name. But it's just south of Berryville on Route 97. It's a ranger station now, and it contains some remains of the D&H Canal, but our story predates the construction of the D&H Canal. Our story involves a man by the name of Benjamin Haynes, who was one of the earliest settlers of the area around Berryville. This is taken from Quinlan's History of Sullivan County. Benjamin Haynes, the pioneer at Handsome Eddie, was one of those brutal men who rush beyond the bounds of civilization because they can find nothing congenial in well-organized and well-regulated communities. This allegation is rendered a verity by the following narrative. So Quinlan is telling us in his inimitable way that Haynes was a ruthless, primitive kind of a guy who was not bound by societal mores. In 1784, 3 Indians named Nicholas, Canape, and Ben Shanks, or Hycon, came to their old camping grounds on the Delaware River to fish and to hunt. Little is known of Nicholas. Canape was a native of Coshecton, or Cushitunk, that we talked about earlier, where he had grown from childhood to manhood, and he was much esteemed. When the colonies revolted, he went to Canada and took up the hatchet for King George. So in other words, he was a Tory. He fought for the British. Ben Shanks was a crafty subtile savage. His Christian name was Benjamin. Before the war, he had worked for the farmers of John Gum and quite often for a man named Shank. From that circumstance, he was known as Shanks Ben, and ultimately, on account of the great length of his legs, as Ben Shanks. He was also known as Ben DeWilt or Wild Ben. One of the, they're hunting and fishing, and they come upon Benjamin Haynes, and Haynes invites them to his place, which is located where Corwin Farm would later be. And he ambushes them along with one of his friends, Tom Quick. And they actually brutally attack the 2 Indians, Canape and Ben Shanks. One of their rifle balls passes through Canape's hand and the lower part of his head. but he doesn't die right away. He ran to Haynes and claimed the protection which he had been promised. So Haynes had told him, you come and have dinner with me and I'll make sure that no one does you harm. But Haynes seizes a pine knot and he begins to beat Canopy about the head with this log. Even Tom Quick, and again, this is Quinlan's writing, even Tom Quick, who for many years has been familiar with scenes of blood, was shocked at Haynes's perfidy. He came up as the latter was dealing out his blows and he shouted, "Damn a man who will promise an Indian protection and then knock him on the head." So here's a drawing by James W. Burbank that shows that you can see Haynes beating Canopy about the head. Meanwhile, Quick has shot Ben Shanks, and Ben Shanks jumps into the water, and he escapes. Corwin Farm is significant for its buildings as intact and representative examples of mid-19th century vernacular architecture and construction. The house there, built in 1840, illustrates a vernacular interpretation of the Greek Revival style. This is from the National Park Service, by the way. The barn, built in 1850, is a wood frame building located immediately adjacent to the towpath and, according to local tradition, served as the stable for Lock 67 on the D&H Canal. The mortise and tenon barn frame is unaltered and the vertical board exterior is substantially intact. Although it no longer holds water, the canal's stone retaining walls, earthen and gravel towpath, and bridge or causeway still convey its 19th century design and use. But there's been a lot of reports of paranormal activity, strange activity at Corwin Farm, and we believe that it's traced back to that brutal ambush of Canopy and Ben Shanks. Here's a picture of what the area looks like today. There's the barn that we just discussed, the house to the right, and in the foreground is the D&H Canal. And that fence, which is a modern addition, is over the causeway or next to the causeway. Here's another picture of a little bit close-up, more of a close-up of the house. So to the left of this frame, you would see an empty field that will go directly to the Delaware River, which is just beyond, just to the left of these buildings is the Delaware. And that's where the attack took place. And to this day, there's a strange energy there along the river, which people believe may be the spirit of Canopy. So let's move to the Minisink battleground, our second haunted area today. And this is currently a Sullivan County park. It's in Minisink Fort, about 4 miles north of Barryville along Route 97. You make a right onto the county road, and the battleground's about a mile up from Route 97. The historical event that leads up to this involves this man who is the Mohawk chief, Joseph Brant. And Joseph Brant, during the Revolutionary War, was aligned with the British. And he had a group of his men who were Mohawks and Seneca, and largely Tories, about 150 men in all. And it was Brant's responsibility, given to him by the British, to raid the settlements along the frontier, to demoralize the settlers, to disrupt the supply chain for the Continental Army, because where did the Army get its food? From the local farmers. They sold the food to the Army. Brant's job was to disrupt that supply chain and also to occupy the militia so that they could not be active in the regular war. And so he made it his business to constantly raid the settlements along the frontier, and that included the settlements in the Mamakating Valley, along the Chestnut Creek, and down into the lower Delaware Valley, along present-day Port Jervis. Cushitunk, interestingly, was never raided by Brant and his men because that was largely a Tory settlement. Almost all of the residents of Cushitunk were Tories. Those who were not had fled when the war broke out. They had left. So Brant and his men on July 20th, 1779, raid the settlement at a place called Peenpack, which is near present-day Port Jervis. And they burned down a number of buildings. They take some scalps. They kill some of the settlers. They drive the rest of them into the blockhouses, and they steal as many cattle and as much of the crops as they can. And they make their way northward. Some of the settlers of Peenpack were able to escape, and they made their way to Goshen and alerted the militia, the Minutemen who were in Goshen, to the raid. And so the Minutemen decided that they would pursue Brant and get back the loot that he stole, all of the cattle and the produce and whatnot. So they give chase. Brant and his men are moving northward along the Delaware River. They have all of the livestock, and so they're moving very slowly. And the militia is able to catch up to them around Berryville. So there are several versions of what happens next. One of the most widely accepted by historians is that Brant becomes aware of the militia's presence. And by the way, the militia is led by, originally led by a Goshen doctor, a physician by the name of Benjamin Tustin. Tustin is a lieutenant colonel in the militia. And it's Tustin's intention to follow Brant, make sure that he leaves the area, but not to engage him in battle, because he knows that his men are merchants and clerks and farmers. They are not seasoned soldiers. Brant has men who are much more experienced in fighting. And so Tustin believes, just make sure that he's out of the area, and then we can protect the settlements, but we won't engage him. But he's shouted down. He's not a professional soldier either. His leadership skills are lacking, and his men say, you know, we intend to get the livestock back. We're going to engage Brant and his men, and they're just going to run. They had a great disdain for Brant and his men, despite his reputation as a seasoned warrior. And so Tustin and his men, he had about 50 men at his command, are then joined as they reach Berryville by another group under Colonel Hathorne from Warwick, who assumes command of the entire group. They're now 100 or more in number. And Hathorne, again, he also believes they should not engage Brant, but the men are determined to do so. Meanwhile, Brant becomes aware of their presence. And according to some historical accounts, Brant approaches them with a symbol of peace. He walks out with a white flag, so to speak, and he says, listen, I've got a group of men here that you're outnumbered. You're also at a disadvantage in terms of experience. My men are seasoned warriors. We don't want to fight. Just let us, we're going to move a little bit north. We'll ford the river, and we'll be on our way back to upstate New York, where our camp is. You know, there'll be no bloodshed. But supposedly during his speech, one of the colonial militia fire at him, and the bullet passes through his belt, and he's very enraged by this. He says, you know, if the battle starts, if we do engage, my men will not stop until you're all dead. And that's exactly what happened. So they end up fighting on a hilltop about 4 miles north of Berryville. And it's a brutally hot day in July 22nd, 1779, 2 days after the raid. They have limited ammunition. They're exhausted by the heat eventually. Once the ammunition is used up, the natives attack, and it becomes hand-to-hand combat, and the colonials get much the worst of it. They're routed. Now, Tustin, being a doctor, he decides that in addition to trying to fight the battle, that he's going to treat the wounded. and he gathers them under a rock outcropping that today has become known as Hospital Rock. And it's there that Tustin and 17 men that he's treating for their wounds are put upon by the Native Americans who have now, and the Tories who have now pierced the lines, and they wipe them out right there at Hospital Rock. The irony is that Tustin could have run like many of the others did. Hathorne issues the order, it's every man for himself. And he actually says to Tustin, you know, come on, man, you know, save yourself. But Tustin, true to his oath as a physician, remains behind to treat the 17 men he has there wounded, and they're all killed and scalped. And so the battleground becomes this burial ground for all of these men, because no one comes to claim the bodies. We believe that 46 militia are killed that day at the battleground, and no one claims their bodies. They're left there. It's not until until 43 years later that a group from Goshen comes up to try to find the remains, and they locate about 300 bones, which is a far cry from the remains of 46 people. Subsequent to that 1822 expedition, they do actually find a soldier who had tried to flee the battleground and make his way to the Delaware River and was killed on the way there. And his body was claimed, and he's buried in a tomb in Lackawaxen, which is known today as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. But since that time, the battleground has become a park. The county now owns it. They have since the 1950s. Prior to that, it was operated by the Minisink Historical Society. And visitors there inevitably report some sort of strange energy, feeling, whatnot, especially children and dogs. I hike there quite often. As I said, it's a county park now. There are trails that you can hike on. I love to hike there in the wintertime with my dog. This is a picture of my dog, Preston, and he gets very skittish at certain areas of the battleground. He's generally very well behaved. He sticks to the trails, but when he gets around the Hospital Rock area, he's very skittish. About 10 years ago, I took my grandson, who at that time was 10 years old, to visit the battleground. This is Hospital Rock. In the background, that's my grandson about 10 years ago. And he said, you know, there's definitely a different feeling here at Hospital Rock than there is elsewhere in the battleground. It's just a very intense kind of energy there. He didn't know what to make of it. He did not suggest that there were ghosts, but he certainly said that he felt something differently. Shortly after our visit that day, someone emailed me a photograph of Hospital Rock, and this is it. And you can see the orb in the photograph. Oftentimes, paranormal activity or ghosts manifest themselves on film or in pictures. Obviously, we don't use film anymore, as these orbs. It's some kind of energy. And I have to tell you, when I received this photograph, and I don't remember at this point now who sent it to me. It was, as I said, about 10 years ago. But I immediately ran up to the battleground, which is only about 5 miles from my house. And I looked around that area of Hospital Rock to see if there could have been possibly something there that was reflecting the sunlight or whatnot. And I couldn't find anything. But as often as I go, I always feel this strange feeling around Hospital Rock. And then a few years later, some totally different person sent me another photo and asked me to explain the orbs in this photo. So this is at the foot of the battleground. This is Route 97 that you're looking at, running left and right in front of you in the middle of this picture. And the little gray building to the left of the frame is actually the interpretive center now for the Delaware Aqueduct that the National Park Service occupies, or better known as the Roebling Bridge. The gray building was built as a toll house, but now it's the interpretive center. So a gentleman who traveled this road regularly as part of his job and would sometimes would pull over here to eat his lunch or whatnot, said he was shooting photographs one day, and one of them came back like this with this orb. And he asked me to explain it. He said, do you know, could there possibly have been an accident on the bridge that would have explained this orb? And I also explained to him, well, that bridge also was part of the D&H Canal. Maybe there was something connected to that. And then I realized, as I'm talking to the guy, that they found the body of that soldier who was fleeing the battleground for the river. He believed that if he could make it to the river, which you can vaguely see through the trees here, you can see the river just to the left of the orb. He was trying to get to the river, believing that if he could get to the river, he would save himself. And he was killed on the way. And his body was found 50 some years later after the battle. And he was buried, but it's possible that there were others also that were killed here. So this orb is most likely connected as well to the Minisink battleground. If you go to the battleground and it's open, although it's officially closed now because of COVID, you can still go, you can hike. The facilities are just not available, the bathroom and the interpretive center and whatnot, but you can use the park and the trails. And you tell me next time we talk if you feel there's some unusual energy there. And now we move to our most famous ghost story in Sullivan County history, the ghost of George Markert at the Stone Arch Bridge in Canosa Lake. This is a story that's been written about quite often. The historical events that account for the ghost sightings date back to 1892. Interestingly, the Stone Arch Bridge is also now a part of a county park. So this is open to the public. I was there fairly recently. It's beautiful this time of year. And the Stone Arch Bridge is intact. It was built around 1850 by some German stonemasons named Hempt. And the Hempt name is quite prominent in Sullivan County history. But the story that leads to the ghost sightings involves two families of German immigrants. And some of you may know that the area of Sullivan County around Jeffersonville and Canosa Lake, or Pike Pond as it was originally known, was heavily populated by German immigrants, largely because a Monticello businessman by the name of Solomon Royce, who owned a lot of the property out in that area, had subdivided the property, created lots, and he sold those lots to German immigrants that he solicited with flyers in German that were handed out in New York City. And it enticed immigrants to come to the mountains and to buy these inexpensive lots and to set up their homesteads here, to farm and whatnot. So two of those families who were related by marriage were the family of George Markert and this gentleman you see in the slide, Adam Height. And George Markert was a fairly successful farmer. He had been married to Adam Height's sister. She died and George Markert remarried, but they continued, their farms were adjacent to one another, and they continued to be fairly close, although once Markert remarried, not as close as they had been. Adam Height, who farmed the adjacent land, was not so successful. And at one point, he began to experience a string of misfortunes. His mother-in-law was murdered. She was a boarding house operator in Jeffersonville named Ursula Ulrich, and she was murdered in 1885. A number of family members were injured in a serious wagon accident, and then his crops failed, and his cows eventually began to give bloody milk. And Adam Height, who was known in the community as being not very bright and very superstitious, became convinced that all of his misfortunes were the result of a hex that had been placed on him by his brother-in-law, George Markert. He believed that Markert had placed the hex on him by patting him on the back 3 times. And he remembered an incident where, in a kind of an unusual way, George Markert had patted him on the back 3 times and said 3 times, "You're a good brother-in-law, Adam. You're a good brother-in-law, Adam. You're a good brother-in-law, Adam." And he believed that that was what placed the hex upon him that caused all of this misfortune in his life. And he begged George Markert to lift the hex, and Markert just kind of laughed at him. We don't know if Markert laughed at him out of disdain or if he just thought it was kind of preposterous that a hex had been placed. But Adam Hite took it very seriously. He actually traveled to Pennsylvania and he consulted with the Hexenmeisters there, the experts on hexes. And you know, the Pennsylvania, what we call the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are really German immigrants, in Pennsylvania, if you look at their barns, they all have the hex signs on them to ward off the hexes and whatnot. They were experts on these hexes, and they convinced Adam that the only way that he could lift the hex was to kill George Markert. If Markert would not willingly lift the hex, he had to kill him. And because Adam Hite reasoned that because the hex had been placed with the action of 3, patting him on the back 3 times and reciting, "You're a good brother-in-law, Adam," 3 times, that he had to kill Markert 3 different ways in order to lift the hex. And so finally, frustrated that Markert will never lift the hex willingly, he enlists the aid of his oldest son, Joseph Hite, pictured here, to ambush Markert on the bridge and to kill him. So Adam arranges to meet Markert one night at Hemp's Tavern, which, by the way, the building is still there. It's now the Stone Arch Inn. And they meet there. They're seen by other community members having a drink together. And then they leave the tavern together. And they travel back toward their home, which is over the Stone Arch Bridge. And this was all part of Adam Hite's plan, because he had been told by the Hexenmeisters that it was important to lure George Markert over running water, because sorcerers or warlocks or Hexenmeisters, whatever name you want to apply to them, are powerless. They lose their power over running water. So the Stone Arch Bridge running over the Callicoon Creek, which is running, will rob him temporarily of his power. And so that's why they lure him to the middle of the bridge, and Joseph Hite comes out of the shadows, and they murder George Markert 3 different ways. Joseph Hite shoots him 5 times. He stabs him with Markert's own knife, and they club him to death with Markert's walking stick. And then they dump the body over the bridge into the water, and it disappears. Now, this is in January of 1892. So Markert obviously doesn't make it home that night from his nightcap at Hemp's Tavern, and his wife puts out the alarm that he's missing. And so the community begins to look for him, and it takes a couple of days, but they finally find his body in the frozen waters of the Callicoon Creek. And he's obviously been killed. He's been murdered. Because most everyone in the community knew about Adam Hite's belief that there had been a hex, suspicion immediately fell upon the Hites. And so the sheriff is called, and the coroner comes, and the coroner examines the body. The sheriff goes to the Hites, and they find the gun. They find bloody clothes that the Hites are trying to burn. And they arrest not just Adam Hite, but 2 of his sons, Joseph, pictured here, the oldest son, and John. Joseph, by the way, is 22, at the time, and John was 20. And they're all taken to Monticello and put in the jail. But John is able to subsequently produce an alibi. So he's released. But Adam Hite and Joseph Hite are charged with the murder. Here's the bridge, by the way. This is a picture taken by my wife a number of years ago. You can see the Callicoon Creek. It's a beautiful sight, especially this time of year. However, a judge rules that Adam Hite is insane, and he confines Adam Hite to what they called at the time an insane asylum. So he is never tried for the murder. He basically gets away with it. He eventually dies in the insane asylum of what at the time was termed chronic melancholia. I guess depression. Joseph Hite does go on trial for the murder, and he is found guilty. He does not actually participate in his defense. He's found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. I believe he serves 15 years, and he gets out, and the rest of his life he lives out on an uneventful life. But the nature of murder, because of the hex, becomes nationwide news. This is an article from the New York Times about the murder. You can see Coroner John Diker, who later becomes sheriff of the county, determines that there's a murder, and they arrest the Heights. This tells a little bit of the background. So again, this is found in the New York Times. Victim of superstition. This New York Times article with the Middletown dateline from January 25th of 1892 not only tells the story of the murder, but it tells the story of the hex. And so this becomes a fascinating story that's spread far and wide. This is a New York Times article where Adam Hite dies at the state hospital, the insane asylum. But once Adam Hite is found insane and is not put on trial, not hanged for the murder, people begin to report sightings of the ghost of Adam Hite, of George Markert on the bridge, and particularly on cold winter nights, which is when the murder took place. So many stories have surfaced over the years about the ghost that just a few years ago, the group Sullivan Paranormal went to the bridge and did a reading. They did readings. They've been there several times, I guess. But this one particular day they were there, and there was their instruments, and I don't exactly understand how they work, but they measure energy, and they also have something called an electronic voice phenomenon recorder, which will actually turn the energy into a voice that you can actually hear. And when they begin to detect the energy, they begin to shout out questions. And this video is all available on YouTube. You can go and watch it. And they actually, when they detect the energy, they actually say, "Who are you? And were you hurt? Were you killed? Who killed you?" And you can distinctly hear the electronic voice phenomenon recorder say, "Adam," which is kind of chilling when you hear it played back. This is the sign that for many years was at the bridge. It's more or less of an historic marker denoting that the bridge is on the National Register of Historic Places. But for many years, this was the bane of my existence, because you'll notice that the sign says one of the few hex murders on record in the Upper Delaware Valley was committed on this bridge in 1882. So people would constantly call me for two reasons, or they would. This was in the days primarily before email, and they would want to know what were the other hex murders. To my knowledge, this is the only hex murder that took place in the Upper Delaware. And secondly, they would always question the fact that in my writings about the murder, I always note that it took place in 1892, which, by the way, is the correct date. This date of 1882 is incorrect. I tried to get the county for years to change this. A number of years ago, they finally took the sign down and agreed to paint over to correct that 1882. However, the folks from DPW who were doing the work lost their jobs. The sign was then, apparently whoever was left didn't know why it was taken down. The sign was put up again with the incorrect date. I continued to try to get the date changed, and finally a few years ago, someone went in and, I think without taking the sign down, just painted over the 1882, and now the sign is correct. So that completes my presentation of the historic events surrounding the 5 ghost sightings in Sullivan County. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have regarding these or other stories. Feel free. So Jonathan, we'll need you now to I guess, one by one, or however you want to do it, to unmute people.
Okay.
Or they can ask questions by chat, I suppose, also, however you want to do it.
Right.
Whatever works for you.
Yeah, they can do that, or if they'd like to go ahead and raise their hand, and I'll unmute you if you have a question.
I saw someone raising their hand. Did someone raise their hand?
I think so.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hello, Nancy. Thank you. I very much enjoyed it. My 8-year-old actually stayed tuned for the entire thing, even though it was loaded with history. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I've got an unrelated, I do a lot of hiking in Rock Hill, where there's an old tannery, Hackles Dam and
Hackle Dam? Yes.
Hackle Dam. I know, yes, Hackle Dam. Leads you to an old, I thought it was a tannery for years. Now I think it might have been a mill. And there was a bridge at one time crossing the Neversink there that's, you can see just.
Correct.
I just wondered if you knew anything, if there were any sketches of the place, or if you knew any good stories regarding it.
Well, I know a lot of stories regarding it, and in terms of sketches, there's a small group of folks who recently completed the one-room school project in the town of Thompson that are now working on a project to chronicle the Hackle Dam project, which I'll explain in a moment what that is. And they're actually building a diorama that will depict Hackle Dam. And so the Hackle Dam project was actually a proposal in the early 1900s to dam up the Neversink there at Hackle Dam. So in effect, creating the Hackle Dam Dam, and to impound water back for 12 miles to create a massive reservoir to create hydroelectric power. This project went on for several years. It was a privately financed project, and because of World War I and some other setbacks that took place, it was never completed. But the proposal was to flood those communities between Hackle Dam and South Fallsburg. So think of how our map would have been drastically changed, the map of Sullivan County. So that was known as the Hackle Dam project. But what they're doing is creating a diorama that will depict that area. And I think that may clear some things up for you. So a man named Hackle created the original settlement there, and it actually moved from one side of the river to the other as the years went by. And there was a school there, the Hackle Dam School, and that's how this group became familiar with the settlement at Hackle Dam. And they had read some of the things that I had written about the dam project. And so they became fascinated by this Hackle Dam project. But hopefully when they release their project, you'll be able to learn a lot more about Hackle Dam.
That's the best news I could have gotten. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Well, either it was a very boring presentation or I covered all the bases and
Nope.
you can't think of anything more. Is there a question up?
Looks like
Beth,
we
are
have
you
one.
raising your hand?
I just unmuted myself. Could you explain again what you were saying about the cut rock and the reason that it gets cold when there's paranormal activities?
Well, again, let me preface it by saying I'm not an expert on ghosts,
Okay.
but in my research, I've spoken to lots of paranormal investigators. The way it's explained to me is that, I guess the spirits are always there, but in order for them to manifest themselves, to become visible or to become audible. So in other words, for us to see the ghost or to hear the ghost and the sounds that they make, they have to take energy, ambient energy. They have to use ambient energy. They have to take energy from the surroundings. And so because they're using that energy to create a vision or noise, the energy that's taken from the air causes the temperature of the air to drop perceptibly. So it gets cold. So when people report ghost sightings, almost always those sightings are accompanied by reports of it getting very cold.
Mm-hmm.
And that rock cut, when you visit the rock cut, not always, but most times, there is a perceptible drop in the temperature as you approach the rock cut, and certainly within the rock cut. Now, many people say, hey, it's underground, what do you expect? But it seems like it's something more than that.
Have you seen orbs yourself in person?
No, I have to say I have never. But I do have to tell you that at the Minisink battleground, where I have spent a lot of time, and at the Smith Hill Cut, where I spend a lot of time, I do notice there's a difference in the air. There's an energy or something. It's like if you walked into an area that was full of static electricity, or you notice the difference. I can't describe it, and I'm not ready to say, yeah, there's ghosts there, but there's something. I have to say there's something. And I have to believe that if 46 men were killed at the Battle of Minisink, for example, and their bodies are left there to be picked through by the wild animals and to rot, that those spirits have, I got to believe that those spirits are there. And I'll tell you a little story associated with Minisink, which I didn't mention when I discussed it. Some of you may know, and some of you may even have attended. Every year, up until the COVID outbreak, we commemorate the Battle of Minisink with a ceremony, a solemn ceremony at the battleground. And a few years ago, one of our legislators was there as a guest speaker. I won't mention his name because if I say Louis Alvarez, you'll know who I'm talking about. And he actually came to me after the ceremony, and he said, actually it was before the ceremony, before we began the ceremony, he asked me, was there a man in the battle named Knapp? Because I was standing here just kind of watching the crowd file in for the event, and I saw 3 men standing there plain as day in colonial garb. I'm paraphrasing, colonial garb, and they were talking amongst themselves, and I could hear them like they were right in front of me, and one of them was named Knapp. And I said, well, actually 2 men named Knapp were killed in the battle. So, and he told me that he had an out-of-body experience during a health crisis that he experienced a few years before, and since then he'd been very sensitive to that kind of thing, and he's often seen ghosts, and so that's something that happened at the Minisink battleground. I've never seen that, but I do have to say there's something there. I feel differently at the battleground. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Any Anybody else? Jonathan, you have a question?
You answered my questions before.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all. Once again, I want to mention before I sign off, remember, if you'd like the book in further retrospect, a donation of $30 or more to the Delaware Company will get you a signed or even an inscribed copy of the book, or you can go on Amazon and purchase it. That way we still get a portion of that money. So it supports a good cause. The Delaware Company is a history education group. We sponsor the History of Sullivan County classes, the Magical History Tour, the bus trip. We do a number of other things, and we're undertaking a massive project, which we'll be announcing very shortly, and probably within the next few weeks, to tell the story of the children who were an integral part of the operation of the D&H Canal. And it's a project, we call it the Kate Project. It will be ongoing for a number of years. It will entail a hiking trail, contemplative seating areas, interpretive signs, and a bronze statue. We'll tell you more about that in the weeks ahead. But the money, that's where the people want to know, what does the Delaware Company do? That's one of our projects. As I said, we also do the Magical History Tour every year, which unfortunately was canceled this year. We do the History of Sullivan County classes, which again, 2 rounds were canceled this year, but hopefully we'll be doing them again next year. And the more money we collect, the more donations we get, the more free classes more scholarships we can give to free seats on the bus, free people taking the classes, etc. So please be generous. And again, thank you for your attentiveness tonight. I know you're anxious to get to the debate. I don't want to compete with the 2 gentlemen. So thanks again. Thank you to the library as well for sponsoring that. Jonathan, thanks for your help. I couldn't have done it without you. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you, John. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for everyone for coming.
Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.